This organization is special. It means so much to so many people. It's a special place to work, too. Our staff...
The landscape surrounding the St. Louis Cardinals entering the 2026 Major League Baseball season is complex, layered, and decisive in ways that few seasons in recent franchise memory have been. Once seen as one of the most stable and consistently competitive organizations in professional baseball, the Cardinals have found themselves navigating a far less familiar environment, one shaped by consecutive frustrations, missed postseason appearances, organizational restructuring, and the pressing need to redefine both strategy and identity in an evolving league. As the club moves into a new competitive chapter under the guiding influence of Chaim Bloom, expectations are no longer simply tied to history or reputation. They now hinge directly on execution, development, sustainability, and the performance of a core group of cornerstone players whose personal progress may very well determine the future direction of the organization. This is not a crisis era for St. Louis, but it is unquestionably a crossroads era, one in which patience and urgency are forced to coexist. Outcomes carry amplified significance, and the margin for error has grown considerably smaller. The Cardinals are not simply hoping to return to relevance. They are building toward a recalibrated competitive model, and the journey toward that objective is already underway. To understand the full dimensions of the Cardinals' present moment and near-future trajectory, one must examine both the structural changes already taking place within the front office and the critical on-field figures whose performance will most significantly shape the franchise's competitive fate. These include young talents such as Winn and Victor Scott II, impact hitters like Iván Herrera, and foundational pieces such as Nolan Gorman and Jordan Walker. Together, they represent both opportunity and uncertainty, the dual reality that defines St. Louis baseball today. A franchise adjusting its identity. For decades, the Cardinals operated under a consistent competitive identity, disciplined, fundamentally strong baseball powered by internally developed talent, stable leadership, and well-structured roster building. This approach earned St. Louis respect as one of the most efficiently run and reliably successful MLB franchises. However, as the broader competitive landscape shifted, with evolving valuation metrics, increased financial aggression across the league, and a growing emphasis on data-driven refinement, the Cardinals' long-trusted model began to show signs of strain. Multiple seasons without postseason baseball underscored an undeniable truth. St. Louis could no longer rely solely on heritage, culture, or previous success formulas. Adaptation became essential, modernization unavoidable. It was within this environment that Chaim Bloom's entrance into the organization gained meaning beyond simple leadership change. Bloom did not merely represent a new executive presence. He symbolized philosophical evolution. Bloom is known across baseball as a builder, someone who thinks beyond momentary results and instead focuses on sustainable, competitive longevity. His previous experiences positioned him well for the type of structural recalibration the Cardinals required. And unlike some external hires, Bloom did not arrive as a distant outsider. His prior analytical familiarity with the organization helped accelerate transition rather than destabilize it. By the time the 2026 season approached, Bloom had already begun refining both operational direction and player development ideology. That said, change does not instantly translate to success. While the Cardinals now operate with greater structural clarity and future orientation, the process still requires tangible results on the field. The team cannot afford to drift through years of mediocrity while waiting idly for a rebuild to organically flourish. Instead, certain key players must anchor that forward progress today. Winn, the defensive anchor whose bat must rise with his role. Among all players currently shaping the Cardinals' next competitive generation, shortstop Winn stands perhaps the most symbolically and practically important. Still just in his early 20s, Winn not only holds a premier defensive position, he carries expectations rooted in elite, measurable skill, advanced instincts, and long-term franchise value. Defensively, Winn has already demonstrated the type of natural excellence that rarely requires narrative embellishment. His range, field coverage, footwork, decision-making speed, and, most prominently, his cannon-like throwing arm place him comfortably among the league's best young defensive infielders. Many scouts and analysts have already projected him as a perennial Gold Glove candidate. This is not speculation. It is simply recognition of the talent he already displays. However, modern baseball requires more than defensive reliability, especially at a position as central as shortstop. To truly become the foundational franchise cornerstone that the Cardinals envision, Winn must progress offensively in parallel with his defensive stability. The expectations are not for him to become a slugging superstar or premier power producer. Rather, the focus is on consistency, on-base reliability, contact efficiency, situational hitting maturity, and offensive presence strong enough to complement his defensive contributions. Winn has shown flashes, stretches where the bat appears lively, confident, and disciplined. Yet across a full season, he has not always sustained that level. That inconsistency is not unique among young players, but it remains an area of strategic importance for the Cardinals. A shortstop who can defend at an elite level while providing offensive steadiness dramatically improves roster flexibility and lineup integrity. If Winn can evolve into that type of two-way contributor, he becomes not only an asset, but a stabilizing pillar in St. Louis' long-term competitive framework. Entering the 2026 campaign, internal confidence surrounding Winn remains strong. His work ethic, maturity, composure, and team-oriented outlook have all been repeatedly highlighted. The organization believes he is physically and psychologically equipped to grow into a leadership caliber player. With his off-season knee stabilization addressed, the expectation is that Winn will not only retain his signature defensive brilliance, but continue to push his offensive performance upward. In many ways, the Cardinals' competitive timeline may ultimately run parallel to Mason Winn's developmental timeline. Victor Scott II, speed, disruption, and the challenge of offensive translation. While Mason Winn represents structural stability, Victor Scott II represents disruptive potential, the kind of dynamic athleticism capable of fundamentally changing how opposing teams defend and strategize. His speed is not simply impressive, it is elite, game-altering, and nearly unparalleled in Major League Baseball today. Scott is reminiscent of the high-paced Cardinals teams of earlier eras, clubs defined by movement, pressure, and relentless base running that force constant defensive reaction. That style has become far less common in modern power-driven baseball, but players like Scott can reignite its tactical relevance. When he is on base, the game does not sit still. It reacts. Pitchers shift focus. Catchers become defensive coordinators. Infield alignments subtly tighten. Opponents are forced into heightened awareness. However, the value of that speed only materializes if Scott reaches base consistently enough to apply pressure. That is where his challenge lies. For Scott to fulfill his full impact potential, several aspects of his offensive profile must sharpen. He must reduce strikeouts. He must emphasize contact quality designed for speed utilization, prioritizing sharp ground balls, line drives, and placement strategy, rather than elevation. He must refine pitch selectivity and plate discipline, allowing him to extend at-bats rather than give away opportunities.
There is no uncertainty about what Scott could become. The question is whether he will evolve quickly enough to influence the Cardinals' present competitive trajectory. The organization appears prepared to support that development, likely providing him substantial opportunity to adjust and grow, rather than limiting his exposure or shortening his leash. If he succeeds, he does more than improve the lineup. He reshapes its rhythm and opponent's defensive mindset. In some scenarios, a Victor Scott breakout season could accelerate the Cardinals' competitive evolution years ahead of projected schedule. In other scenarios, slower development may simply mean his most impactful years align more closely with the latter stages of Bloom's long-term plan. Either way, he remains a central figure in St. Louis's future reality. Iván Herrera, the offensive threat St. Louis cannot afford to lose. If Winn represents structure and Scott represents dynamic disruption, Iván Herrera represents something the Cardinals desperately require: raw offensive danger. Few hitters within the organization possess the same blend of power potential, on-base ability, and run production capability that Herrera has demonstrated when healthy. His presence in the lineup changes defensive planning, pitchers are forced into more careful sequences, mistakes become punishable, run-scoring probability increases simply by his being available. For a team seeking to reconstruct legitimate offensive impact, Herrera stands as one of the most naturally gifted options. But his greatest challenge is availability. Durability concerns have followed Herrera, particularly relating to the physical demands of catching. While his defensive competence behind the plate is not in question, the sheer strain of the position has repeatedly limited his ability to remain consistently active. For the Cardinals, this is not a minor inconvenience. It is a major strategic dilemma. If Herrera cannot maintain regular health as a catcher, St. Louis must confront a difficult but necessary question. Is it more valuable to preserve his defensive role or adjust his positional usage in order to maximize his offensive presence? Multiple franchises across modern baseball have already navigated similar circumstances, prioritizing a bat so essential to a lineup that positional duty becomes secondary. If Herrera's offensive output continues to prove critical, the Cardinals may need to protect it.
whether that means rotational catching, reduced defensive workload, or repositioning entirely. In a competitive era where St. Louis cannot rely on an overwhelming abundance of elite hitters, losing Herrera for extended stretches is not something they can afford. His significance extends beyond statistical contribution. He represents the kind of offensive timeliness that often determines game outcomes and seasonal direction. Nolan Gorman and Jordan Walker. Talent is not the question. Dependability is. Two of the most widely discussed figures within the Cardinals' current core are Nolan Gorman and Jordan Walker. Both possess unquestionable talent. Both have already demonstrated the capability to produce meaningful offensive value. Both have been, at various points, described as future core anchors. But neither have yet sustained that level of impact consistently. The Cardinals do not require either player to reinvent who they are. They do not need dramatic overhaul nor radical transformation. What St. Louis requires is reliability, season-long steadiness, fewer prolonged slumps, more repeatable performance, and less variance between ceilings and floors. When Gorman and Walker are productive at the same time, the Cardinals' lineup becomes significantly more competitive. Run support increases. Opposing pitching strategies must adjust. Complementary hitters face improved pitch conditions. The offense looks closer to that of a contending team rather than a developing one. When both fade simultaneously, offensive pressure collapses, and the team's broader structural effort struggles to compensate. In some ways, Gorman and Walker represent a bridge, the connection between past Cardinals' competitive expectation and future competitive ambition. Their stability would not single-handedly elevate St. Louis into dominant contention, but it would dramatically improve the team's present legitimacy and reduce pressure on younger developing contributors. The reality is simple. The Cardinals do not merely need potential. They need performance. Gorman and Walker are two of the clearest pathways to attaining it. Where the Cardinals truly stand today. Despite narrative speculation, the St. Louis Cardinals are not in collapse. They are not dismantled. They are not entering an era of hopeless drift. Instead, they are navigating intentional recalibration, a process that requires both strategic patience and competitive accountability. The organization has not completely torn down its roster in favor of a pure rebuilding philosophy. Instead, it has chosen a controlled transition, one in which select veterans, emerging talents, and developing prospects are expected to collectively sustain respectability, while simultaneously building toward renewed strength. Publicly and internally, a realistic, competitive expectation has been framed around the late 2020s. This does not suggest irrelevance until then. Rather, it reflects pragmatic acknowledgement that genuine championship-level sustainability requires foundation rather than shortcuts. But timelines can compress. If Mason Winn matures offensively into a two-dimensional cornerstone, Victor Scott II translates his speed into consistent, base-driven disruption. Iván Herrera remains available and productive, and Nolan Gorman, along with Jordan Walker, deliver dependable offensive contribution. The Cardinals could accelerate their competitive window far sooner than projected. That outcome does not require miracle seasons, only growth, health, and consistency. Conversely, if development stalls, injuries persist, or inconsistency remains dominant, the Cardinals will face more difficult decisions, potentially reinforcing longer-term rebuilding necessity. The difference between those paths may be determined over the next 18 months. A franchise still defined by expectation, not excuses. The Cardinals' identity has never been built around accepting mediocrity. Even today, when adjusting to modern realities, the franchise still carries competitive expectation embedded into its culture. Fans do not measure seasons lightly. The organization does not evaluate progress casually. There is a measurable standard in St. Louis, and the responsibility to respect it extends to both players and leadership. Chaim Bloom's presence does not signal resignation. It signals recalibrated ambition. The youth movement does not denote vulnerability. It represents reconstruction. The franchise has chosen not to panic, and whether that restraint ultimately proves wise will be determined on the field. Every step forward enhances credibility. Every missed opportunity extends uncertainty. What remains undeniable is that the Cardinals are not drifting without direction. They are building, not hastily, not recklessly, but deliberately. Looking ahead, what the 2026 season truly means. The upcoming 2026 campaign is not a final exam. It is a defining assessment point. It is a season that will reveal which players are authentic, long-term pillars, which remain developing possibilities, and which may ultimately fall outside the future framework. It is a year that will allow Chaim Bloom and the Cardinals leadership team to evaluate with clarity rather than speculation. More importantly, it is a year that may very well determine whether St. Louis moves toward accelerated contention or settles into extended rebuild rhythm. The Cardinals do not aspire solely to avoid losing seasons. They seek to restore credibility, competitive presence, and postseason relevance. The question is no longer whether this matters to the organization. It is simply whether the emerging core can turn possibility into performance. Time will deliver that answer. For now, one reality remains clear. The Cardinals are no longer defined by who they were. They are defined by who they must become. And that journey has only just begun.